Hello, everybody. I'm Jasmine Qureshi, and so I'm the first keynote speaker, and it's super, super exciting because I've actually never been to Chester Zoo, so this is the first time. And so the only part I've seen of the zoo so far is the bit where you come in at the back, and then a cheetah that we went past that was just kind of sitting there. But even that was absolutely amazing, and I'd probably just leave with that and be like, that's incredible. But so I'm going to be doing the first talk, and so I'm going to be talking about wildlife and storytelling. And this is quite an interesting topic for me because I didn't really come from a background that everyone who goes into wildlife goes into. And I think storytelling for me is kind of a core aspect of all of the different jobs that I do, which means that I get to do so many different things. And then I get to talk about storytelling and how everyone else can go into wildlife or natural history, whatever your background is and wherever you want to go, because it's so versatile and it's so incredible. So just going to talk a bit about what I do. We're going to be here for a while. This is my longest slide. There aren't actually any other slides. So in terms of what I do, I'm a freelance journalist and a writer. So as a journalist, I do work on wildlife and conservation most of the time. I write for different magazines. So I've written for BBC Wildlife magazine, and I've written for the Wildlife Trust and the RSPB. I am a marine biologist, so a lot of the work that I do focuses on marine biology and conservation science. And when I write for magazines, I normally write about conservation, but I also write about diversity. And I also write about the need for racial diversity, for other types of diversity, the need to centre the wildlife conversation around gender, around lots of other norms that we have and we always talk about in society, but we don't seem to talk about a lot in natural history, and why they're important to the natural history world and to progress what we think about the natural world and how we work in it as well. So I also talk about sexuality, queerness. I also talk about philanthropy and philosophy and all of these different topics. And they kind of boil down into something that's called intersectionality. So for me, intersectionality is this soup of ideas that everyone has. If you look at everyone around the world, everyone works in different jobs, everyone does different things. But really, if you look at all of them, they are linked very much so to wildlife and to conservation. You could probably link every job in the world to the natural world. And so what I try and do is I try and link up all the dots so people can see how important their own jobs are to the natural world, but also so you can see how important saving the natural world is, because everyone's involved in it and it is very important to everyone's futures. Up until recently, I worked as a wildlife television researcher for the BBC Natural History Unit. That meant that I worked on shows like Deadly 60, I don't know if anyone's seen that, and I also worked on various other documentaries and programmes. And for that was a really interesting part of my career, because what I'd wanted to do for so long was tie in research, tie in writing, and tie in wildlife filmmaking, because as a freelance wildlife filmmaker, I've always wanted to go to the ends of the earth. I've always wanted to explore different countries, look at different wildlife around the world, and explore, because I think that's what you really want to do when you really watch documentaries and when you get to grips with a lot of the wildlife. You want to see it and you want to experience it firsthand. So that's what I wanted to do as a wildlife filmmaker. So one of the first steps was becoming a researcher. I now work for a film company called Sound Off Films, and I'm going to talk a bit more in this presentation about how different people from different backgrounds can go into that, and you don't necessarily have to come from a wildlife background. Like I've said, I'm a filmmaker, so I do make films mainly about entomology and bumblebees. That also ties into my work as an ambassador for the Bumblebee Conservation Trust. Bumblebees and pollinators have been around me since I was really, really young, and since I grew up in a very urban area. So I grew up in central London, and you wouldn't think there was much natural history there at all, but I just got to grips with a lot of the bugs and a lot of the plants that existed there. And so I'm really, really passionate about pollination. Even though I did my degree in marine biology, one of the first presentations I did was on bees. And they sort of went, I think you're doing the wrong course. But it all worked out fine in the end, because I managed to link up pollination and marine biology. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that as well, about how you can go into courses and want to do various things in wildlife. But at the end of the day, it's wildlife and it is all linked. So you can actually do anything you want. I'm also an engagement officer for A Focus on Nature. So You may not have heard of them, but A Focus on Nature are a youth-led nature organisation, and we work to get young people into the natural history industry, whether that be media, whether that be writing, art, whatever it may be. It's really cool to link up lots of different people. We have mentor schemes. Connor, who is also on the youth board, is also on the committee, and is probably more involved at the moment because I have too many things to do. I'm a speaker, so I speak at science festivals. So I've spoken at Cheltenham Science Festival. I'm speaking here in front of you, if you would believe it. I speak at a lot of other things. Really, for me, when I'm talking about all the different things I do, it's so you can get a grasp of how many different jobs you can do, even though I work with wildlife mainly. So you get a chance to do all the things that you want to do, even though I'm still working around conserving wildlife, speaking about it, sharing about science, about people, about activism, all of these different things. As a presenter, I've worked with CBeebies. I did a little thing for teeny tiny creatures on starfish, which is so cool. And I've done presenting for other shows and programs as well. So yeah, I think that's quite a lot of things, really. But who am I really inside? I think this is really important. So I've talked about some of the jobs that I have. And I've talked about how this talk is about storytelling, and it's about discussing what directions you want to go in terms of creating a narrative, because that's what storytelling is. You're changing perspectives. You're changing people's ideas of things. When you're writing books, when you're making films, when you're doing anything, you're changing a perspective and you're building a narrative around things. And that is so important to wildlife conservation. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to become a filmmaker in the first place, because you get to change people's ideas about how wildlife works. But you also get to change ideas about how people work and about how people work in the wildlife industry. And you can't do that without first realizing how people work and how we as people are different. So I am all of these things. I am queer, I am trans, I'm Pakistani, I'm Indian, I'm non-binary, I'm intersectional in the way that I exist in this sphere, in this arena. I'm still a nature nut, and I'm a storyteller. The reason this is important is because at the end of the day, when you're talking about stories and about where I'm from in terms of my queerness, in terms of how my transness, and in terms of where I'm from as a person of colour or a minority fits into this natural history industry, what I'm talking about is how people work around the world with nature and about how people think. And as I've said here, the power of storytelling is in the detail and the variety. If you want to tell a good story, you have to talk about different perspectives. You have to have a wider perspective. If you're going to talk about something as a woman in natural history, if you're going to talk about something as a child in natural history, if you're going to talk about anything, you are a different person than is the status quo in natural history at the moment. And so you're going to have a different perspective, and it's going to be interesting. And it's going to be something that other people haven't seen before. So it's a good idea to hone in on that difference and to decide, this is not going to be something that weakens me in a world where it is a minority thing. This is going to be something that strengthens my idea because it's different and because it comes from a new place. Of course, I have faced obstacles in this sphere because of the differences that I have. And many people here will face obstacles. And as people who are interested in nature, the biggest obstacle is, of course, that it is going extinct and that things are dying out and that the world needs us to fight right now. Whereas before we might have had, a few years ago, a more relaxed view when we're going into natural history, that we just love it, we just like to be surrounded by it and we like to be interested in it. But now we have to fight for it. And so an important part of telling a story about wildlife in this day and age is talking about who's fighting for it, why we're fighting for it, why we all have to fight for it. And so if you're going to talk about fighting for it, you have to talk about the obstacles that people face in it. For example, the fact that when I was younger, I didn't really see anyone who looked like me on TV. I didn't really see anyone who sounded or was like me or had an experience like me in natural history. And everyone here will probably have experienced that in some way or another. I'm not saying you all have experienced it in the same way that I have, but you understand that there are obstacles there. when you're talking about wildlife and when you're going into wildlife. And so I think that's very important to hone in on, especially when you're telling stories about it. The love we inject into these stories. A lot of the time when I go and talk to scientists and when I interview people in STEM and when I interview people in biology and conservation, the best conservationists and the best ecologists are the people who are passionate and emotional about the wildlife and the conservation they talk about. They're not systematic. They don't necessarily understand all of the maths behind it. They don't understand all of the science about it. And this is a common misconception when we're talking about STEM, is that it is this straight line, systematic, very much a small and narrow lane that we talk about, but actually it's emotional, it's full of love, it's full of people feeling things about nature and about the wildlife that they're talking about. And I think that's also really important. And it's important to understand where people come from. It's important to understand that we are people and we aren't separate from wildlife. We're very much the same. So that's something to keep in mind, I think, when we're talking about telling stories about conservation. So this is something that's very important to how I tell stories. I've been researching this for a while now, and I've done a few papers on it, and I'm looking to make a few films on it, and I'm talking to a few people about doing panels on it. I've done a few panels for wildlife film festivals. It's this idea that the natural world and the way we understand it is not a binary-based thing. If you look at the natural world, if you look at ecology, if you look at biology, if you look at the way we learn about all of these things, it's been taught to us in a way that it's just one thing or the other. But it's not. If you look at the natural world, it's full of spectrums. It's full of things that are ever so slightly from one thing or the other. It's full of a circle of different types of organisms that display almost the same thing, but slightly not. It's this flexibility and it's this knowledge that we don't know anything about and we don't know everything about the natural world that makes it a good story to tell, because it's this chaos that we don't understand yet. So we tell stories about it and we go into the unknown to tell stories, even more stories about it. If we knew everything about it, if nature was just one thing or the other, it wouldn't really be very interesting to tell stories about because we'd know everything about it. So it's this idea that we need to unlearn how we talk about wildlife and how we talk about conservation in order to protect it. This idea that everything is simply one thing or the other is something that stops us from understanding it and pushing our progress of it. It's something that links into a patriarchal view of the natural world, why there aren't enough people who aren't straight, white, cis males in the natural history industry, and why we need to make it more accessible is because we need to relearn everything we know about natural history in order to save natural history as we know it. So these are just some of the things that I kind of like to talk about. And again, when we're talking about queer ecology and when we're talking about storytelling, what we're talking about is new perspectives. We're talking about new stories. One of the things that we always learn when I worked at the Natural History Unit, and one of the things that I learned when I was talking to programmers, when I go on the radio to talk to producers, they want a new story. They want a new thing to talk about, but they don't actually know all of the stories that have been told already. And so whilst you need to know about new things and new wildlife, you can actually talk about the old things, but in a new way. And that's what we need to be doing. We need to be rethinking how we think about wildlife, and we need to be rethinking how we tell stories about it. And everyone here is already equipped to do that. You don't need to do a degree in marine biology. You don't need to do a degree in anything specific. You don't need to have a bunch of experience before you do it. You are storytellers. You came along to this talk because you're interested in wildlife, because you're interested in nature. So you can tell stories about it already. And that's the point. That's the power of storytelling. It's that anyone can do it because everyone has their own perspective already. So these are just some examples. And this, again, is talking about the amount of things that you can do if you're interested in wildlife. So Rhea and the Tree of Lights, this was a theatre production that actually asked me to consult on their production. And it was about this little girl's story as she went into the world and she understood marine biology. She understood the coastline, and she understood marine biology from the perspective of our ancestors. And they asked me to be a consultant because I do marine biology, but also because I've been talking about natural history. So you can go into things like theatre. You can be on the radio and talk about bees. You can talk about your interest in natural history, because that's what I did, and that's what I keep doing. You can write for magazines that you never would have thought you would have written for, because they don't explicitly or aren't explicitly connected to the natural world. But we found a link. And I talked about how, as a climate activist, I also talk about how the North and South divide in the world is very much linked to climate activism. It's linked to how we think about wildlife and nature. And that links directly back to who you are as a person. Where do you live? What things are happening in your environment around you? Who are the people you know? Are they being affected by climate activism? Are they being affected by the climate? Does that mean you can't work in the natural history industry anymore? Does that mean that the wildlife that you want to see won't be there anymore? These are all things that you can think about. You can write for magazines about the intelligence and the variety of organisms, which is something that I've done before, all the way to diversity in the natural history world and whether or not we're having enough people learning about the natural world, because that links in directly to our future. As young people, a lot of us are always told there's not enough of us. There's not enough of us being told about the natural world. There's not enough of us learning about the natural world. And we have that experience of being limited by some of the things that have been put in place at the moment. And you can use that to your advantage. The fact that I have built a career, almost, in the beginning of talking about why I wasn't in this career, that's something that you can use. Again, these are a few things that I've done. And what this is going to talk about is the breadth of storytelling again. And I'm going to keep mentioning the word storytelling, whether that be 2 words or 1. But I'm going to keep mentioning these because it's really, really useful to keep going on about how storytelling is the way forward, and how we change how we think about storytelling is something that's really important. And it's also something really important to talk about when you go to panels, when you go and talk to different conservationists, when you lead panels, because everyone in here will do that. I've seen a lot of people who come to the talks that I do. I then meet at panels. I then meet at other things, and they're doing the panel. They're leading the panels. And I remember going to talks to other people, and now I'm doing the talks. So if you're passionate about wildlife and conservation, you will end up probably speaking about it as a young person. You will probably end up leading something, presenting something, because the world we live in now is something that needs young voices to stand up and to talk about wildlife and conservation and to make stories about it. So people here will probably end up doing that. And I'll look forward to seeing some familiar faces when I go to other talks. Again, one of the most important parts of my storytelling career is filmmaking. It's how do you create a story around wildlife, and how do you film it, and how do you produce it in a way that people will want to look at it and be entertained by it. A main thing that we were told when we were working on films like Deadly 60 or shows like Deadly 60 even, is that you need to make it entertaining to people, but you also need to put a message out. You need to make it understandable to people that this is a world that's worth saving. This is something that we treasure. This is something that we love. And you also need to talk about how it's important to protect this world, but also that it's important to love this world. You can't just protect it for the sake that this is our future, but you also need to grow to love it. And that's one of the things I love about storytelling in film. I love how films do that. I love how they change people's ideas of everything. I love how they change people's ideas of the future and how they restore ideas about the past. With writing and with storytelling, I think these two things are interlinked very, very closely. And most people who are interested in storytelling in some kind of way will have written in some kind of way, will be interested in writing things, whether that be art, whether that be poetry, whether that be creative writing, whether that be films, whatever it may be, people will want to write. And so almost changing this idea that there needs to be any sort of barrier on how we write about natural history is important in changing our idea of who can write about it. So when I did a writer's retreat last weekend, it was the first creative writing retreat that I'd ever led. And my main idea that I went in with was write in a wrong way. Write as if no one's told you about punctuation or grammar. No one's told you about the rules of writing. No one's told you that you have to write in a certain way with full stops and capitals and whatever. Because when you write about something in that way, you're talking about something that you're passionate about, and you're just putting it straight onto a page. And I think that's important in storytelling as well, is to do things passionately and don't worry too much about the rules, because that can often limit us in what we do, because we think too much about who's going to see it, who's going to be affected by it, will this get me to a certain place? But actually, if I'm doing something and I'm passionate about it, that passion will show through whatever I do. So I think that's an important thing to do. Write in a wrong way and do things without looking at the rules too much. And I think that's one of the ways that most of these events come about. I'm pretty sure this event came about with doing that, because you talk about things and you want to do things and you think about things that have never been done before. And that means you have to think about them in a different way. So this is one of the most amazing things that I got to do. I got to be on the cover of Attitude magazine with this person who is very incredible, Bimini Bombulash, who is an amazing drag queen, and my friend who's an incredible activist, and Dan O'Neill, who everyone probably knows, who is an amazing wildlife cameraman and broadcaster. For this, we really focused on stories, we focused on marine wildlife, but we focused on doing it in a way that wasn't the same as everyone else. And again, this shows you what different things you can do. I never would have thought when I was younger that going into wildlife storytelling and broadcasting would mean that I get to do this, that I get to talk about people like me, that I get to talk about things which aren't necessarily about the natural world, but they're linked into it because everything is. Now, if this works, I'm going to show you the video that we did. Disclaimer, this does dead name me because I hadn't changed my name at that point. So. So anyway, the video that I'm going to show is the campaign that we did. So we worked with the media production company Freeborn. We worked with Attitude magazine. We got together a ton of different activists. We got together a ton of different crew who were all queer and who worked on this program with us. These were all people who'd never worked in natural history before. They didn't really know what they were doing a lot of the time, but they knew film and they knew how to work with people. And then we came in as the activists, and me and Dan, who knew about wildlife and marine wildlife especially, and we really got to grips with how you film wildlife and how you film nature. And so we managed, in an intersectional way, to link up all of these things. And that's what intersectionality is about, I think. It's about linking up all of these different things that you find, and it's about linking up all of these different skills that you already have to create something new and to create something which will send a message to people who don't normally get to see that message, because that's what we want at the end of the day. Not a lot of people know what's happening with the natural world. So we want to see if we can make something that they will see, and then they'll understand more about the natural world, and then hopefully we can get more people on board with saving it. I mean, whilst that's going on, I could probably talk about this slide. Be useful. So what I've been talking about is changing our way of storytelling. I've been talking about storytelling as we've already done it, how we want to change it, what new people we want in it, why it's important to get new people involved, why it's important for everyone here to be interested in storytelling if you're interested in nature. And that's because it's to secure our futures. I know I've talked about love. I know I've talked about injecting emotion into it, but it's a necessity. We have a natural world that's beautiful, incredible, that contains so many different kinds of people, that contains so many different kinds of ideas. We have a world that is, whether you like it or not, linked to the natural world. The ocean to me really means flexibility and freedom. I'm Qureshi. I'm a trans non-binary woman, an activist, a writer. I am also a person of colour and Muslim. Oftentimes I'll go to speak at different events and I'm the only one there who looks like me, and whilst that's very much an honour to be speaking on these issues, that's not useful. That's not a sustainable form of growth, because then I become a tokenistic aspect of this movement and I become an individual speaking from my very own experiences. We need more people. And it doesn't really matter how much or little you know. It's not really about all or nothing. Once you relate to the natural world in any way, then you become a warrior and a protector for the natural world. So we need to change our stories now to secure our future. So we've been doing the same thing for ages. We've been telling the same stories in the same way. That's what we've been doing, really. And we need to change how we tell those stories. We need to change how we talk about wildlife and nature. We need to change who's talking about it. It's time for a different crew of people, I think. It's time for people with a different set of eyes, ears, mouth, and hands. And these are the new generation. These are the people who are thinking about, how do we film wildlife in a different way? How can we go out and talk about it in a different way? How can we tell stories about it? How can we write things about it? How can we use my experience as an accountant? How can we use my experience as someone who's done an English degree? How can we use someone who's had experience being an artist, being a painter? What do you want to do? What are you passionate about? What exactly do you like and enjoy that means that you don't have to not go into wildlife and natural history? You can do the things you're interested in. You can be a musician. You can be someone who's a dancer. You can use all of these things and you can work with the natural world. And the thing is, that is a form of protest against the status quo that's telling you that you just need to be one thing. That's a way of experiencing everything rather than just experiencing one thing and not allowing yourself to learn so much about the beauty of our natural world, because you can learn about it in so many different incredible ways. And it's about our future and the future we spin, the future we weave. We are telling a story as we grow up. We are telling a story as we go into the future, and we are going to be continuing to tell stories. And so if you have this in your mind that you don't have to tell stories in the way you've been told before, just tell the stories that you exist in. Tell the stories that you want to tell. Tell the stories about the things you are passionate about. But if you look at wildlife, I promise you, you will be passionate about it. And probably don't need to tell everyone that over here, but it's a really good thing to say on camera. And someone could write it down. That would be really good. So I think at the end of the day, this is the message that I want you to all go away with. Is wildlife storytelling can be so varied. It can be so exciting. It can be so strange and interesting. And everyone here is already equipped. By staying yourselves and by incredibly and amazingly being yourself and understanding that inside of you is already the tools to tell all of these stories, you already are passionate about things. You already have skill sets. You already like writing probably, or you like listening to audio, or you like watching films. These are all skills that you can use to tell amazing stories about the natural world. And I would like for everyone to come and grab a piece of it, because there's unlimited supplies of it, and it's not an area where we don't need this and that and the other thing. So I would prefer if everyone would start telling stories right now, if you like. You can go away or clap now or something. Cool, yeah. So the question was, how do I pitch ideas to magazines and to various places that I work with? So this is one thing that I actually had to learn very early on, is how to pitch a story and how to make someone believe that the story you're telling and that the person who's telling it, you, is someone who should be telling it, and it's something that should be out in the world. So what I do normally is I talk about my own experience with this story. I talk about why I'm the most important person to tell it, because I've experienced it in this way, and so experienced it in a way that no one else has experienced it, because it's my experience. I usually talk about my background, why I'm interested in this. Again, you don't have to be someone who's from a background that I'm from. I will talk about how I'm a marine biologist. I will talk about how I'm a writer and a journalist, but I will also talk about some of my other interests and what else I'm passionate about. And if you can link those in, that's an important part of a pitch, is linking everything together and understanding that at the end of the day, they want an interesting story and they want someone who's interesting to them to tell it. So you need to also look at who you're pitching to, and you also need to look at what they usually write and if they've written anything on this particular topic before. And another good idea is, and something that I talk about when I'm doing seminars on journalism or when I'm doing seminars on filmmaking, is to network. Network is one of the most important things that you can do as a storyteller, especially a writer and a filmmaker. And that's something that I'll talk about on the conservation careers panel later. Networking, knowing people, finding things out about the people you're going to work for, going to networking events. there is a certain inaccessibility or accessibility to these things, which again, we can probably talk about later. But at the end of the day, if you're pitching to someone, you need to know who they are. You need to be passionate about the story you're trying to tell. You need to be someone who has had experience with that story, I think, whether that be you read about it and you thought something, or whether it be you actually experienced it. And you just need to put that passion on a page, I think. So that's probably core to a lot of the campaigns that I'm part of. So the question was, how do you get people who initially aren't really interested in wildlife, or probably wouldn't be stereotypically interested in wildlife, to be interested in it and passionate about the natural world? Is that correct? So I normally pick up something that they're interested in and show them how it's linked into the natural world. We did that with the See Our Futures campaign. We looked at the fact that this is a queer magazine, it's Attitude magazine. Who's really going to be thinking about the ocean? Who's really going to be thinking about hedgehogs? Who's really going to be thinking about anything natural history when they're reading it? Probably not that many people. And the magazine had never done anything to do with natural history before. So what we did was we combined it with fashion. We combined it with music. We combined it with a very, very famous drag artist. You combine it with things that they're already interested in, that people already know and love, and then you show them how it's linked into the natural world. Because I kid you not, you will find a link with anything. Anything at all in the world, you can link it into the natural world. So I would say finding something that people are interested in and then showing them how it's linked into something you're interested in. I think sharing a common interest is a main way of communicating how people can love the same thing. Oh, that's a question focused on me. It's a scary one. So that was about what I want to do in the future, what aspirations I've got in terms of storytelling. I'm kind of just making it all up. No. So for me, I've always wanted to be a storyteller. Ever since I was really, really young, I've blogged about it. I've wanted to be a filmmaker. And that's what I kind of want to do. I want to be a filmmaker. I want to tell stories through film. I want to produce, direct, make, and tell stories that people haven't been told before in a way they've never had them being told before. And I want to make them about the natural world. But I also want to be an author. I also want to tell stories in different ways. I want to write about things. I want to just tell stories in different mediums. But I also just want to be passionate about things for the sake of being passionate about them. I want to use this storytelling in my own space sometimes, when I'm not really doing it for work, and when I'm not really doing it to change anyone's ideologies about things, because that makes you a more fuller is not even a way of speaking. It makes you a storyteller who's better than everyone else, because you're honing that experience in your own time. You're allowing yourself to feel interested in things. So that's what I want to do, I think. I want to continue to tell stories. I want to be a filmmaker. I want to do different projects. And I'd also really like to see a dinosaur, but that's not going to happen. So that's interesting. I've heard that a lot before, actually, this kind of perspective that we need a common enemy and then we need someone to push back against, because then it creates all of us almost in this unified force. I think it can be useful. I think if you can provide an enemy that is actually an enemy and not just a person who you're maligning for issues that other people who are good could have, then it's useful. So if you're going to provide an enemy, for example, large corporations, for example, oil companies, whatever you may have as a common enemy, if that common enemy is something that is ruining the lives of the majority of people and I think destroying social norms and not allowing us to protect wildlife and conservation in the way that we want, I think that's useful. I think common enemies aren't always very useful, though, most of the time, just because we live in a society that is quite ableist at the moment, that is patriarchal. And I'm going to try not to go off on this kind of tangent, because this is one of the things I like to talk about a lot. I don't think it's very useful to have common enemies in that respect, because we don't really understand what enemies are yet. Because we don't allow everyone to have a voice and we don't allow everyone to have a spotlight, it means that they can often become the enemy by mistake. So I think sometimes they're useful, but most of the time not. Oh, those are really good questions. So the first one's an interesting one, and you also might have to remind me what it is. Backlash. Backlash, okay. So when when I'm telling stories, people do tend to fight back because people don't like change, really. And you don't normally like when your perspective that you've gone with for a very long time is being told it's wrong, it's not something that we should be doing anymore. Even if it is wrong, people don't really like that to be told. And so I have faced backlash before when people have said things like, why are you talking about gender and you're talking about birds? Why are you talking about conservation? You're talking about sexuality. Why are you talking about being a person of colour in nature? That isn't really relevant. Why are you talking about that? And a lot of comments on social media, a lot of people sometimes in the street. So when we face these kinds of people who are pushing back against change, what you kind of need to understand is at that point in time when they're causing that level of distress to you, or when they are backlashing, as it were, they're in a very angry, not very ignorant space, not very informed space, quite an ignorant space. And so it's probably best to leave that conversation alone and come back to it when everyone's calmed down, and usually go onto a different platform like social media. I like to kind of tweet things or write essays or pitch an idea to a magazine, if you will. I remember one time someone talked about gender, and they talked about the fact that it hasn't really got a place in natural history. And so I sort of went, okay, that's fine. And then I wrote an article about it for someone else. And that really, what that does is that puts it out into the world as a piece that people can then learn about. And I think that's much more useful than me arguing with someone over social media or even in person about anything, because people won't listen if they're angry. And the second question is something that I've kind of struggled with. So growing up, I was always taught to learn about natural history in a certain way. I was always taught to learn about science in a certain way. And when I went to university to do marine biology, I didn't think I could do natural history because I thought, I've got so many other interests. I've got so many other things that I want to do. How on earth am I going to be able to do these things and still be passionate about the natural world? Because that's just not something that I can see around me. I think the only way that we can do it is by that queer ecology example that I've talked about. It doesn't have to be to do with queerness, by the way. It doesn't have to be to do with being gay. But it's a good way of talking about how to unlearn how you've been taught about things already. We are taught about things in a very binary, straight-laced, very narrow-minded fashion. And if we can just teach things to people in a way that they understand that everything is completely different, but you just have to be passionate about certain subjects. You have to understand spectrum-based learning. You have to understand the natural world is full of things that we reflect as people. If you can link that into people and society and make it as important as the other topics that they learn, for example, I think natural history and the love of the natural world isn't really seen as important as maths, or it's not seen as important as other things, even though those are linked to the natural world. So I think making things important to people, like I've said before, by finding common interests, that's a good way of getting people on board. And just understanding that not everyone's going to be learning at the same pace as well. I think when we learn about topics, we learn about them in a very fast way, and we don't often get all of the details or everything we're passionate about. So I think that's another way of doing that.